Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Crime Country. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined by a very special guest. We are truly honored to have him on our channel, and that is none other than Dr. Aamodt. In short, if you have ever read a serial killer statistic, or if you have heard of the serial killer database, Dr. Aamodt is one of the most influential figures in bringing you this fascinating data relating to the subjects that we love to study. And so, Dr. Aamodt, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, happy to do it.
For those in my audience who may not be familiar with you, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my background is actually going to be kind of surprising given our topic today of serial murder. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, which means that I work with organizations to help them hire good employees and to treat them fairly once they've been hired. But I started my career as a professor of industrial psychology at Radford University. And while I was at Radford, my department chair came up to me and said, you work with police departments, don't you? And I said, I do. And he goes, well, good. You're going to go ahead and teach forensic psychology in the spring. I said, I don't know anything about forensic psychology. And he said, you're the closest we've got. So over the next 20-something years, I actually learned a few things about forensic psychology. And in teaching the course, the students really enjoyed the topic of serial murder. But at the time, and this is back in the 80s, you didn't really have a lot of good information on serial killers. You had a lot of books written about them, but not really a lot of good scientific information. So I started off in the class and had the students do what I called a serial killer timeline, where they took a particular serial killer, kind of started at the killer's birth, and did a timeline of their life and their crimes. And the idea was to see whether or not that particular serial killer was similar to what we talked about in terms of characteristics of aggressive people or violent people. And as those started piling up, I thought, you know what, let me get him out of the cabinet and maybe put him into a spreadsheet. And 20-something, or actually 30-something years later, we have the Radford Florida Gulf Coast University serial killer database. But there was no intent to start it at the beginning, but it's become a really, I think, useful tool.
It is truly phenomenal. From true crime books to online articles, many of us, especially fellow true crime buffs, researchers, will notice that there is a particular reference that we see quite frequently cited, and that is the serial killer database. Would you walk us through how it operates today, and how is the data gathered, and how is it actually used?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, it started out with just the student timelines, but then it started to grow. We started doing more research. I had students who were interested in researching serial murder, so I had them join with me, and we started adding data. All of our data comes from public sources, so it's not like we have access, for example, to the FBI database. Nobody has access to that. We wouldn't want to use, for example, psychological reports because then we couldn't share the data. So everything is coming from public sources, and we gather information from a variety of sources. Court decisions oftentimes will give you a lot of good information because during the sentencing phase, they'll talk about a serial killer's background. So we get information there. Prison records provided some good information in terms of things like dates of birth and the race and age of the serial killer. We use media accounts, and you have to be careful with media accounts. We always try to get at least two sources of information on each fact that we have in there, because there are a lot of information on the web and in media accounts that just isn't accurate. We use true crime biographies, and those vary tremendously in how accurate they're going to be. There's some where the authors are meticulous researchers and the information is solid, and other ones not so much. I remember one of the students getting really frustrated with the true crime book that they had because they listed 3 different dates of birth for the serial killer, and that makes you kind of doubt what else is in there. And then we use Ancestry.com, and that's going to sound like a strange source, but Ancestry.com gives you really good information about birth and death records. It gives you information about military history. And so when we finally started using that, that really gave us a lot of good information. And there's another source called newspapers.com, which has thousands of newspapers across the country where we can get multiple articles about a serial killer that you wouldn't normally see. When I first started the database, there wasn't an internet, and so all of our information had to come from going to the library and looking at major newspapers. But with something like newspapers.com, you can get the articles that come out of a local newspaper on a serial killer that nobody's ever heard of.
That's amazing. Till just now, I'd never even heard of that. And so now I'm even curious to check it out myself. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining me on Crime Country as we went over the serial killer database, statistics, and so much more involving the true crime subjects that we are all fascinated and oftentimes terrified by. To all of my subscribers, don't forget to check out the links in the video description below. It'll take you to the database, serial killer statistics, and all of the awesome work that Dr. Aamodt is doing. Dr. Aamodt, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.